My name is Jessica Martinez, and I thought bringing my husband to my grandfather's will reading was just being polite. The Sullivan family had been buzzing for weeks about Grandpa Bobby's fortune, the hardware store, the rental properties, the lifetime of savings from a man who never spent a dime on himself. Everyone assumed they knew exactly how that money would be divided. My Uncle Tom had already started talking about expanding his insurance business. My cousin Kevin was planning to quit his job at the factory. My mother Linda was dreaming about finally paying off her mortgage and maybe taking that trip to Ireland she'd been saving for since I was 10. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But when I walked into that law office in downtown Riverside with David by my side, everything changed. The moment my family saw my husband's face, the room went completely silent. Not the respectful silence you expect at a will reading, but the kind of silence that comes when someone's entire world shifts beneath their feet. What they discovered in that moment didn't just alter who would inherit my grandfather's $1.5 million estate. It revealed a secret that had been buried in our family for over 30 years, and by the time the lawyer finished reading, the people who had dismissed me my entire life were forced to confront a truth that changed everything they thought they knew about Bobby Sullivan and the legacy he left behind. The foundation of this story begins with understanding who my grandfather really was, not just to our family, but to everyone whose life he touched in Riverside, Ohio. Bobby Sullivan wasn't born wealthy. He grew up during the Depression in a house where dinner sometimes meant bread and butter, where his father worked double shifts at the steel mill just to keep the lights on. When he turned 18 in 1952, Bobby had two choices: follow his father into the mill or find his own path. He chose the army. Korea changed him. Not in the obvious ways that people talk about with veterans, though he carried those scars too. It changed him because it showed him what real brotherhood looked like. He used to tell me stories about the men in his unit, how they shared everything, looked out for each other's families back home, how they promised that if something happened to one of them, the others would make sure their loved ones were taken care of. Those weren't just wartime promises for Bobby, they were sacred vows that shaped how he lived the rest of his life. When he came home in 1954, he didn't go to the mill. Instead, he used his GI benefits to learn the hardware business, working for old Mr. Peterson downtown, until he could afford to buy the store himself in 1961. Sullivan's Hardware became more than just a business. It became the place where young fathers learned how to fix their first homes, where widows could get help with repairs without being overcharged, where kids could earn their first dollars sweeping floors and organizing inventory. Bobby didn't just sell hammers and nails, he sold hope and self-reliance, and he built a fortune doing it. But Bobby Sullivan's wealth wasn't just about business success. He understood something that a lot of people in small towns miss: real estate is everything. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, while other people were buying new cars and taking vacations, Bobby was quietly purchasing rental properties around Riverside. Nothing fancy, just solid houses in working-class neighborhoods where people needed affordable places to live. He never raised rents arbitrarily, never evicted families going through hard times, and often let people work off their rent by helping with repairs or maintenance. By the time I was old enough to understand what wealth looked like, my grandfather owned 12 rental properties, the hardware store, and had investments that most people in town couldn't even pronounce. What made Bobby special wasn't his money though, it was his heart. Every Sunday after Mass at St. Mary B'Sess, he'd drive around town checking on people, not tenants, not customers, just people. Mrs. O'Brien, whose husband died in Vietnam, always found her driveway mysteriously shoveled after snowstorms. The Martinez family, new immigrants who barely spoke English, discovered someone had anonymously paid their daughter's college application fees. When the Kowalski boy needed surgery the family couldn't afford, a generous donor covered the hospital bills, and everyone in town knew who that donor was, even though Bobby never admitted it. This was the man who raised me when my parents' marriage fell apart. My father left when I was 7, disappearing into the Ohio night with his girlfriend and half of my mother's savings. Mom did her best, but she was working 2 jobs and raising my brother Ryan alone. Bobby stepped in without being asked, the way he always did when people needed help. I spent every weekend at his house on Maple Street, learning how to change oil in his garage, helping him tend the vegetable garden behind the kitchen, listening to his stories about Korea and the early days of the hardware store. He taught me that wealth wasn't about accumulation, it was about contribution. He showed me how to use tools not just to fix things, but to build something lasting. Most importantly, he demonstrated what it meant to keep your word, no matter what it cost you. When Bobby Sullivan made a promise, it was as solid as the foundation of his house. When he told someone he'd take care of them, they never had to worry again. When he said he'd remember them, he meant it with his whole heart. That's why, when he started getting sick in 2023, I spent every Tuesday evening at his house, helping him organize his affairs, listening to him reminisce about the old days, making sure he wasn't alone. Bobby had emphysema from years of smoking, and the doctor said his heart was wearing out, but his mind stayed sharp right until the end. During those Tuesday visits, he'd often pull out old photo albums, pointing to pictures of people I'd never met, telling stories about promises he'd made decades ago. There was one photo he returned to repeatedly. It showed him in his army uniform, arm around another young soldier, both of them grinning at the camera with the kind of carefree joy that only exists before life teaches you how much loss you can bear. Bobby would stare at that photo for long minutes, his weathered fingers tracing the edges, and sometimes I'd catch him whispering something I couldn't quite hear. When I asked about it, he'd just smile and say, "Some friendships go deeper than blood, Jesse, deeper than time too." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was just being sentimental about his war buddies. But that photo, and the secret it represented, would eventually explain why my family's assumptions about his will were so completely wrong. My relationship with the rest of the Sullivan family had always been complicated, not hostile, exactly, but distant in the way that happens when people have different values and priorities. My Uncle Tom was a good man, but he measured success by the size of your house and the model of your car. He'd built a comfortable life selling insurance, and he'd raised his kids Kevin and Ashley to expect comfort as their birthright. Tom couldn't understand why I'd chosen nursing, a profession he saw as both underpaid and unnecessarily stressful, when I could have gone into business or married someone with better prospects. My cousin Kevin, 5 years older than me, had inherited Tom's materialistic streak, but none of his work ethic. Kevin bounced between factory jobs, always convinced that his next opportunity would make him rich without requiring much effort. He'd spent years talking about starting his own construction company, but it never progressed beyond buying expensive tools he rarely used and complaining about his current boss. Kevin saw Bobby's wealth.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
As his ticket out of manual labor, the inheritance that would finally let him live the life he felt he deserved. Ashley was different, more focused, but also more calculating. She'd married well, to a dentist named Mark Davis, and they lived in the nicest subdivision in Cedar Falls. Ashley had always been Bobby's favorite among the grandchildren, mainly because she remembered his birthday and called him every few weeks. But even her affection felt strategic, like an investment in her future inheritance. She'd often make comments about how the hardware store should stay in the family, how Bobby's properties could be developed into something more profitable, how his old-fashioned way of doing business was leaving money on the table. Then there was my brother Ryan, the golden boy who could do no wrong in my mother's eyes, despite doing very little right in his own life. Ryan had Bobby's charm, but none of his integrity. He'd been in and out of trouble since high school, never quite crossing the line into serious crime, but always dancing on the edge. DUIs, unpaid debts, a string of jobs that ended with him quitting or being fired. Mom kept hoping that Bobby's influence would straighten him out, but Bobby was too wise to be fooled by Ryan's occasional shows of remorse and temporary bursts of responsibility. My mother Linda occupied a unique position in this family dynamic. As Bobby's only daughter, she felt entitled to the largest share of his estate, but as someone who'd made questionable choices throughout her life, she worried that he might not see things the same way. Linda had always been jealous of the attention Bobby paid to me, interpreting his interest in my education and career as criticism of her parenting. She couldn't understand that Bobby helped me because I was trying to build something meaningful, not because he thought less of her. The tension around Bobby's will had been building for months before he died. It started with small comments, casual observations about his age and health, that gradually became more pointed discussions about inheritance and family obligations. Tom would stop by the hardware store and make suggestions about modernizing the business, clearly positioning himself as the logical heir to take over operations. Kevin would volunteer for projects around Bobby's house, hoping his grandfather would notice his handiwork and remember it when writing his will. Ashley would bring her children to visit more frequently, ensuring they had relationships with their great-grandfather that might translate into financial benefits later. Everyone assumed they knew how Bobby's mind worked. He was traditional, family-oriented, generous to a fault. Surely he'd divide his estate among his children and grandchildren, probably giving the largest shares to Tom and Linda as his direct descendants, with smaller amounts going to the grandchildren. The hardware store would go to Tom, who had business experience, or maybe to Kevin, who could learn to run it. The rental properties would be sold and the proceeds distributed. It was all so logical, so predictable, so fair according to the conventional wisdom of family inheritance. But they didn't really know Bobby Sullivan. They knew the version of him that showed up at family gatherings, the grandfather who remembered birthdays and handed out $20 bills at Christmas. They didn't know the man who lay awake at night, thinking about promises he'd made 30 years ago, who kept certain photographs in a locked drawer, who understood that family isn't always defined by blood, and that debts of honor don't expire just because time passes. I was the only one who spent real time with Bobby during his final months, which meant I was the only one who witnessed the phone calls. They started coming more frequently in 2024, always in the evening, always when he thought I wasn't listening. Bobby would answer in his formal voice, the one he used for business, but then it would soften into something more intimate, more emotional. He'd talk quietly for 10 or 15 minutes, and afterward, he'd sit in his chair staring out the window with an expression I'd never seen before. When I asked who was calling, he'd just say it was an old friend, someone he'd served with, nothing for me to worry about. The calls seemed to energize him in a way that family visits didn't. After hanging up, he'd spend hours in his basement office, going through old boxes, pulling out documents I'd never seen, making notes in a leather journal he kept locked in his desk drawer. Sometimes I'd hear him talking to himself down there, not the rambling of an old man losing his memory, but focused conversations as if he were working through complex problems that required careful consideration. One evening in May, about 2 months before he died, I came upstairs from the basement to find Bobby sitting at his kitchen table with papers spread everywhere. Legal documents, bank statements, property deeds, photographs, letters yellow with age. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes, but he was smiling. "Jessie," he said, "sometimes doing the right thing takes a long time. Sometimes you have to wait for the right moment, the right circumstances. But when that moment comes, you don't hesitate. You follow through on your promises, no matter what anybody thinks." I asked him what he was talking about, but he just gathered up the papers and patted my hand. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, "and when you do, I hope you'll know that everything I did was about love. Not the easy kind of love, the kind that makes people comfortable, the hard kind, the kind that changes lives." That conversation haunted me for weeks. Bobby was clearly planning something significant enough to make him emotional, but he wasn't ready to share the details. All I could do was continue our Tuesday evening visits, help him with whatever he needed, and trust that when the time came, he'd explain what he'd been preparing for. The end came suddenly in July. Bobby had a massive heart attack while working in his garden, surrounded by the tomatoes and peppers he'd been tending all summer. Mrs. Peterson next door found him an hour later, peaceful among the plants he'd nurtured with the same care he'd shown people throughout his life. The funeral was packed, with people standing in the back of St. Mary's and spilling out into the parking lot. Half the town came to pay their respects to the man who'd helped build their community, one act of kindness at a time. But even in death, Bobby Sullivan had one more surprise in store for everyone who thought they knew him. The reading of his will was scheduled for August 15th at the offices of Brooks and Associates downtown. Margaret Brooks had been Bobby's lawyer for 15 years, handling the incorporation of his rental property business and updating his will periodically as his wealth grew. Everyone expected a straightforward proceeding, the kind of formal but predictable gathering where family members learn exactly what they'd inherited and begin making plans for their newfound wealth. I almost didn't bring David to the reading. We'd only been married 6 months, having had a small ceremony during the COVID pandemic, with just immediate family present. Most of the extended Sullivan clan had never properly met my husband, partly due to the timing of our wedding, and partly because David was naturally quiet around new people. He'd grown up in California, the son of Chinese immigrants, and he sometimes felt out of place in the heavily Irish Catholic environment of Riverside family gatherings. But David insisted on coming with me. "This is about your grandfather," he said. "The man who helped raise you, who meant everything to you. Of course I should be there. I want to support you, and I want to pay my respects to his memory." His quiet certainty convinced me. David had never met Bobby, but he'd heard countless stories about him during our courtship. In many ways, David understood my grandfather better than some of the family members who'd known him for decades, because David recognized the kind of principled, generous man Bobby had been. So on that hot August morning, David and I drove from our apartment in Cedar Falls to downtown Riverside, both of us dressed in our most respectful clothes, both of us expecting to hear about modest inheritances that might help us pay down my student loans, or maybe take a real honeymoon. I was nervous about how the family would react to David's presence, worried they might see it as presumptuous or inappropriate. But David held my hand as we walked into Brooks and Associates, and his calm confidence helped steady my nerves. The law office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the morning light. Margaret Brooks had arranged chairs in a semicircle facing her desk, and family members were already seated when we arrived. Tom and Carol sat in the front row, Tom checking his watch repeatedly, and Carol clutching a tissue, even though she hadn't been particularly close to Bobby. Kevin slouched in his chair, wearing a dress shirt that was too tight and a tie that looked borrowed. Ashley sat perfectly poised next to her husband Mark, both of them looking like they were attending a board meeting rather than a family gathering. My mother Linda had saved seats for Ryan and me, but when she saw David, her expression tightened slightly. It wasn't hostility exactly, but it was clear she hadn't expected him to attend. "Jessica," she said quietly. "I didn't realize David was coming." "He wanted to pay his respects," I replied, settling into the chair next to her. David took the seat beside me, nodding politely to everyone and offering quiet condolences. The family responded with the kind of stilted pleasantries people use when they're being polite, but not particularly welcoming. That's when I noticed the change in the room's atmosphere. It was subtle at first, just an odd tension that seemed to settle over everyone when David sat down. Tom kept glancing over at us, not at me, but specifically at David, with an expression I couldn't quite read. Kevin was staring too, his usual casual demeanor replaced by something more focused, more alert. Even Ashley seemed distracted, stealing looks at my husband when she thought no one would notice. Margaret Brooks entered at exactly 10 o'clock, carrying a thick folder and wearing the kind of serious expression lawyers adopt for important occasions. She was a woman in her 50s, gray-haired and professional, someone who'd handled enough estate readings to know how to balance compassion with efficiency. She offered brief condolences to the family, spoke about Bobby's contributions to the community, and then opened the folder containing his final wishes. "Before I begin," she said, "I want to mention that this will contain some unusual provisions." Robert specifically requested that I read it in its entirety, without summarizing or skipping sections, because he wanted everyone to understand not just what he decided, but why he decided it. This may take longer than typical will readings, but I ask for your patience as we honor his final wishes. That should have been our first clue, that this wasn't going to be a standard division of assets among family members. But everyone was too focused on the size of their expected inheritances to pay attention to the warning signs. Tom straightened in his chair, Kevin stopped fidgeting, and Ashley pulled out her phone to discreetly take notes. They were all ready to hear their names called and their futures secured. Margaret cleared her throat and began reading in her clear professional voice. "I, Robert Francis Sullivan, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my final will and testament, with the hope that my family will understand the decisions I have made are based on love, honor and promises that transcend the ordinary obligations of inheritance." The formal language continued for several paragraphs, covering the standard legal provisions about debts and taxes, and the appointment of Margaret as executor. Then she reached the first specific bequest, and that's when the family's assumptions began to crumble. "To my daughter Linda Martinez, who has struggled financially since her divorce, and who has worked tirelessly to provide for her children, I leave the sum of $50,000 to be used for her own security and well-being. This amount reflects my love for her and my hope that she will use this gift to build the stable future she deserves." $50,000. It was generous by normal standards, life-changing money for someone in my mother's position, but it was a fraction of what she'd expected. Linda's face went pale, and I could see her doing the math in her head. If the estate was worth $1.5 million, and she was getting $50,000, how was the rest being divided? "To my son Thomas Sullivan," Margaret continued, "who has built a successful business and provided well for his family, I leave the sum of $75,000 and my collection of military memorabilia, with the hope that he will preserve these items and share their stories with future generations." Tom's jaw tightened. 75,000 was significant, but it wasn't the inheritance of a primary heir. It wasn't enough to expand his business or secure his retirement. It certainly wasn't enough to justify the years he'd spent positioning himself as Bobby's logical successor. Margaret kept reading. "Kevin received $25,000 and Bobby's workshop tools. Ashley got $40,000, and the family jewelry. Ryan, to everyone's surprise, received only $10,000, and a stern admonition to use the money wisely and seek help for his ongoing problems." Each bequest was accompanied by personal messages that showed Bobby had thought carefully about every family member's needs and circumstances, but none of them represented the major inheritance everyone had expected. The math was getting disturbing. Even if you added up all the family bequests, plus the smaller amounts going to Bobby's church and favorite charities, it still left over $1 million unaccounted for. Where was the hardware store? The rental properties? The bulk of his investment portfolio? That's when Margaret reached the part of the will that changed everything, and that's when the family finally understood why David's presence in that room wasn't just supportive, it was absolutely essential. "The remainder of my estate," Margaret read, her voice taking on a slightly different tone, "including Sullivan's hardware, all rental properties, investment accounts, and my personal residence, I leave in its entirety to David Chen, the son I never had the privilege to raise, but whose father I promised to care for, as my own brother 32 years ago, in a hospital in Seoul, South Korea." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the air conditioning cycling in the building's basement. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Everyone just stared at Margaret Brooks, as if she'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language, and then slowly, one by one, they turned to look at David. My husband sat perfectly still, his face a mask of controlled emotion, but I could see his hands trembling slightly in his lap. This wasn't news to him. Somehow, David had known this moment was coming, and he'd been dreading it as much as he'd been preparing for it. Furthermore, Margaret continued, I want my family to understand that this decision was not made lightly or recently. David's father, Lieutenant James Chen, saved my life during the Korean War and died protecting our unit from enemy fire. Before he died, he asked me to watch over his family, to make sure his wife and unborn child would be cared for. I gave my word to a dying hero, and I have spent the last 32 years keeping that promise, through regular financial support, educational assistance, and now this final gift. David Chen is not just inheriting my wealth, he is inheriting the love and gratitude I owed his father, a debt that can never truly be repaid, but must always be honored. The room exploded. Not literally, but the silence shattered into a chaos of voices, accusations, and disbelief that transformed the dignified law office into something resembling a battlefield. Tom was on his feet, demanding to know how this was possible, insisting there had to be a mistake. Kevin was shouting about fraud and legal challenges. Ashley was firing questions at Margaret about the validity of the will, the timeline of its creation, the possibility of appealing the decision. But through all the noise and confusion, I was looking at my husband, seeing him with completely new eyes, understanding for the first time that our love story was actually the final chapter of a much longer story that had begun before either of us was born. David Chen wasn't just the man I'd fallen in love with and married. He was the living embodiment of my grandfather's deepest values, the proof that Bobby Sullivan's promises meant more to him than blood relations or family expectations. And as the chaos continued around us, as lawyers were threatened and family bonds were shattered, I realized that this inheritance wasn't just about money, it was about honor, sacrifice, and the kind of love that transcends generations. It was about a promise made by a young soldier to a dying friend, and the lifetime of commitment required to keep that promise alive. The will reading was far from over, but already I knew that nothing would ever be the same for the Sullivan family. The grandfather we thought we knew had revealed himself to be someone entirely different, someone whose loyalties ran deeper than we'd imagined, and whose definition of family extended far beyond the boundaries we'd assumed. David was about to inherit $1.3 million and become one of the wealthiest young men in Riverside, Ohio. But more than that, he was about to inherit the burden of living up to both his father's heroism and my grandfather's faithfulness, and somehow, looking at his quiet dignity in that room full of chaos, I knew he was ready for both challenges. Parts 2-5 The devastating aftermath and growing isolation. The explosion of voices in Margaret Brooks's office felt like a physical assault. Tom Sullivan's face had turned a deep red that made me worry about his blood pressure, and he was jabbing his finger at David while demanding answers that none of us could provide in that moment. Kevin had knocked over his chair in his haste to stand up, and he was pacing behind the semicircle of seats like a caged animal, muttering curses under his breath, and occasionally stopping to stare at my husband as if he could change reality through sheer force of will. Ashley had her phone out and was frantically typing, probably researching inheritance law or looking up attorneys who specialized in will contests. Her husband Mark sat frozen beside her, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding around him but unsure how to extract himself from the situation. My mother Linda hadn't moved from her chair, but tears were streaming down her face, not tears of grief but tears of shock, and what I was beginning to recognize as profound betrayal. "This is impossible," Tom kept saying, his voice getting louder with each repetition. "Dad would never do this to his own family. He loved us, he raised us, we're his children, his grandchildren. This makes no sense. Margaret Brooks remained professionally calm throughout the outburst, but I could see the tension in her shoulders as she waited for the family to compose themselves enough to continue. She'd obviously expected this reaction, which meant she'd known about the contents of Bobby's will for some time. How long had she been keeping this secret? How many conversations had she had with my grandfather about his unusual decision to leave everything to David? I understand this is shocking, Margaret said once the volume of complaints had decreased slightly, but I assure you that this will was executed properly, with full legal authority, and Robert was completely competent when he made these decisions. I have documentation of multiple conversations we had over the past 2 years as he refined these provisions. 2 years, Bobby had been planning this for 2 years, which meant he'd started making these arrangements shortly after David and I began dating seriously. That realization hit me like a physical blow because it suggested that my grandfather's decision wasn't just about honoring his old promise to David's father. It was also about welcoming David into our family in the most profound way possible by making him the primary inheritor of everything Bobby had built. But the family wasn't interested in the emotional or historical context of Bobby's decision. They wanted to know about legal challenges, about the possibility that the will could be overturned, about whether David had somehow manipulated an elderly man into changing his inheritance plans. The accusations started flying fast and furious, each family member contributing their own theory about what had really happened. Kevin was convinced that David had taken advantage of Bobby's loneliness and declining health to insert himself into the will. He's been playing some kind of long game, Kevin insisted, pointing at David with undisguised hostility. Marrying Jessica to get close to the family, probably researching Bobby's finances, figuring out how to cash in. This whole Korean War story is probably made up. Ashley was more measured in her approach, but no less determined to find flaws in the inheritance. We need to see documentation, she said to Margaret. Birth certificates, military records, proof that this James Chen actually existed and actually served with our grandfather. We need to verify every claim made in this will before any assets are transferred. Tom took a different angle, focusing on Bobby's mental state during his final years. Dad had emphysema, he was on medication, he wasn't thinking clearly. Anyone could see that he was becoming forgetful and confused. This David person obviously took advantage of an sick old man, probably convinced him to change his will when he wasn't competent to make such a major decision. The cruelest attack came from Ryan, who had been silent during the initial explosion but finally spoke up with the kind of vicious clarity that only comes from years of disappointment and resentment. Jessica's known about this the whole time, he said, his voice cutting through the other arguments. She's been playing us all, pretending to be the devoted granddaughter while she and her husband worked together to steal our inheritance. She probably helped him research the family, fed him information about Bobby's finances, maybe even forged some of these Korean War documents. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and suddenly everyone was looking at me with suspicion instead of just confusion. The idea that I had betrayed my own family, that I had conspired to defraud my own mother and brother, was so absurd that I couldn't even formulate a response. But silence in that moment looked like guilt, and I could see doubt creeping into even Linda's expression as she tried to reconcile her knowledge of me with Ryan's ugly suggestion. David finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear enough to cut through the chaos. "I never met your grandfather," he said, addressing the room but looking directly at Tom. "I never spoke to him, never visited his house, never had any contact with him at all. Jessica and I have been together for 2 years, married for 6 months, and in all that time I met Bobby Sullivan exactly never. So whatever you think I did to influence his decision, it didn't happen through any personal interaction between us." The simple truth of David's statement should have deflated some of the conspiracy theories, but instead it seemed to make the family angrier. If David hadn't manipulated Bobby directly, then the Korean War connection had to be fabricated, which meant the entire will was based on fraudulent premises. The accusations shifted from personal manipulation to documentary fraud, with family members demanding to see military records, death certificates, and correspondence that would prove the relationship between James Chen and Bobby Sullivan. Margaret Brooks had apparently anticipated these demands because she pulled out a second folder, this one even thicker than the first. Robert provided extensive documentation to support the claims made in his will, she said. I have copies of military service records for both Robert Sullivan and James Chen, casualty reports from the Korean conflict, letters of commendation, even some personal correspondence between the two men before James was killed in action. She began spreading documents across her desk, creating a paper trail that stretched back over 70 years. Military identification cards with photographs of young men who looked nothing like the aged grandfather I remembered or the husband sitting beside me, but whose names and service numbers matched the claims in the will. Battle reports that described the engagement where James Chen died protecting his unit, including specific testimony from Robert Sullivan about his fellow soldiers' heroism and sacrifice. Most compelling were the personal letters, handwritten notes between Bobby and James during their service, casual communications between friends who had found brotherhood in the brutal circumstances of war. The handwriting in those letters matched samples of Bobby's writing that the family recognized, and the tone of the correspondence revealed a depth of friendship that none of us had suspected existed. But perhaps the most devastating piece of evidence was a photograph that Margaret pulled from the bottom of the stack. It showed two soldiers in Korean War uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera with the kind of unguarded joy that only exists in moments of perfect friendship. One of the soldiers was clearly recognizable as a young Bobby Sullivan, despite the decades that separated that photograph from the grandfather we remembered. The other soldier was Asian, with features that strongly resembled David, and written on the back of the photograph in Bobby's distinctive handwriting were the words Jimmy Chen and Bobby Sullivan, Seoul 1952. Brothers forever. The photograph circulated around the room in stunned silence, each family member staring at concrete proof that the Korean War connection wasn't fabricated or exaggerated. Bobby Sullivan and James Chen had indeed been close friends, close enough to make the kind of promises that Bobby had apparently kept for the next 32 years. The soldier in that photograph looked enough like David to make their family relationship undeniable, and the genuine affection visible between the two men explained why Bobby had felt obligated to honor his commitment to James's family. But rather than accepting the evidence and beginning to process the emotional reality of Bobby's decision, the family doubled down on their outrage and disbelief. The existence of the Korean War friendship didn't justify disinheriting his own children and grandchildren. The promise to care for James Chen's family didn't require leaving them the entire estate. There had to be other options, more reasonable ways to honor the commitment without destroying the financial future of Bobby's biological relatives. Tom was the most vocal in expressing this perspective. I don't care if this James Chen saved Dad's life 20 times over, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. We're his family, we're his blood. We're the people who lived with him, loved him, took care of him when he got sick. This David person is a complete stranger who just happens to be related to someone Dad knew 70 years ago. How does that give him more right to Dad's estate than his own children? It was a fair question, and one that Margaret Brooks seemed prepared to answer with additional documentation from Bobby's will. She opened a third folder and began reading what appeared to be a lengthy personal letter that Bobby had written to explain his decision to the family. I know that my choice to leave the majority of my estate to David Chen will seem incomprehensible and hurtful to my children and grandchildren. Margaret read in Bobby's words. Please understand that this decision was not made in anger, disappointment, or preference for David over my biological family. It was made in fulfillment of a sacred promise that has shaped every day of my life since 1952. The letter continued for several pages, describing in detail the circumstances of James Chen's death and the promise Bobby had made to care for James's wife and unborn child. But more than just explaining the historical context, Bobby's letter revealed the extent to which he had been involved in David's life over the years, financial support and guidance that none of us had known about. According to Bobby's letter, he had been sending money to James's widow, Helen Chen, from the moment he returned from Korea. Not large amounts, but consistent contributions that helped her raise David as a single mother in California. When David showed academic promise, Bobby had anonymously funded his college education. When David decided to pursue nursing, Bobby had covered the costs of his training. When David needed help with a down payment for his first apartment, Bobby had provided it through intermediaries who never revealed the source of the assistance. David Chen has been my responsibility and my joy for 32 years, Bobby's letter explained. I have watched him grow into the kind of man his father would have been proud of, someone who dedicates his life to caring for others, someone who understands the value of service and sacrifice. He has never asked me for anything, never even knew I was involved in supporting his family, but he has given me the satisfaction of keeping my promise to his father. The letter went on to describe Bobby's relationship with David in terms that he had never used to describe his relationships with his biological family members. David represented the best of both his father and Bobby himself, someone who embodied the values of honor and service that had defined Bobby's own life. The inheritance wasn't just about money or property, it was about passing those values to someone who would continue Bobby's legacy of generosity and community service. But Bobby's most pointed commentary was reserved for his assessment of his own family's relationship with wealth and responsibility. Without being deliberately cruel, he noted that his children and grandchildren had come to expect financial support without corresponding efforts to contribute to their community or help others in need. They saw his wealth as their birthright rather than as a tool for positive impact, and they had never shown interest in the values that had driven Bobby to accumulate that wealth in the first place. I love my family deeply, Bobby's letter concluded, but I have seen no evidence that they would use this inheritance to honor the principles that guided my life. They would spend it on themselves, improve their own circumstances, and forget the obligations that come with wealth. David Chen, through his choice to become a nurse and his commitment to helping others, has already demonstrated the character that would make him a worthy steward of everything I have built. The brutality of that assessment landed like a physical blow on everyone in the room. Bobby hadn't just chosen David over his biological family because of a promise made 70 years ago. He had chosen David because he believed David was a better person than any of his own relatives, someone more deserving of the fortune Bobby had spent his lifetime accumulating. The silence that followed Margaret's reading of Bobby's letter was different from the earlier silence of shock and confusion. This was the silence of people confronting truths about themselves that they had never been forced to acknowledge. Bobby's assessment of his family's character wasn't entirely unfair, and everyone in that room knew it. They had expected to inherit his wealth, not because they had earned it or because they would use it wisely, but simply because they shared his DNA. But knowing that Bobby's assessment contained elements of truth didn't make it less painful or less infuriating. Linda was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of profound hurt and disappointment. "How could he do this to us?" she asked, not addressing anyone in particular but speaking to the room as a whole. "How could he pretend to love us for all these years while secretly planning to give everything away to someone we've never even met?" How could he lie to us about what we meant to him? It was a heartbreaking question, and one that revealed the depth of the family's sense of betrayal. They hadn't just lost an expected inheritance. They had discovered that the man they thought they knew, the grandfather and father who had seemed to care about their well-being and their futures, had actually been judging them for years and finding them lacking in comparison to a stranger. Ryan's response was more typical of his character, focused on the practical implications rather than the emotional devastation. "This is fraud," he said flatly. "Dad was mentally compromised. He was manipulated by someone who researched our family and figured out how to exploit his war guilt. No competent person gives away $3 million to someone they've never met. We're going to challenge this will. We're going to prove that Dad wasn't capable of making this decision, and we're going to get our rightful inheritance back." Kevin and Ashley immediately voiced their agreement with Ryan's plan, and suddenly the room was filled with talk of lawyers and legal challenges and the various grounds on which Bobby's will could be contested. Mental incompetence, undue influence, fraud, documentary forgery, every possible avenue for overturning the inheritance was discussed and evaluated for its likelihood of success. Tom was more measured in his response, but no less determined to fight Bobby's decision. "We need to approach this systematically," he said, taking charge of the family's reaction in the way he often did during crises. "We need our own lawyer, someone who specializes in will contests. We need to gather evidence about Dad's mental state during his final years, medical records that might show cognitive decline or susceptibility to manipulation. We need to investigate this David person, find out how he really learned about our family, what kind of research he did to create this elaborate Korean War story." The family was unifying around their shared sense of injustice and their determination to fight the will, but their unity excluded David and me completely. We had become the enemy, the outsiders, who had somehow stolen what belonged to the Sullivan family by right of birth and relationship. The fact that I was Bobby's granddaughter, that I had cared for him during his final months, that I had genuinely loved him without any expectation of financial reward, none of that mattered anymore. I had married the wrong person, and that marriage had cost the family their inheritance. Margaret Brooks tried to restore some semblance of order to the proceedings, reminding everyone that will contests were expensive, time-consuming, and rarely successful. When the deceased had been represented by competent legal counsel, she had extensive documentation of her conversations with Bobby over the 2 years he had been refining his will, evidence that he had been mentally sharp and fully aware of the implications of his decisions. The military records supporting David's family connection were authentic and verifiable through official government sources. Any legal challenge would have to overcome substantial evidence that Bobby's will represented his true wishes, made with full knowledge and legal capacity. But the family was beyond listening to legal advice that didn't support their predetermined conclusion that the will must be invalid. They were convinced that Bobby's decision was so fundamentally wrong, so contrary to basic human nature and family loyalty, that there had to be some explanation other than his genuine choice to honor a 70-year-old promise. The meeting finally ended when Tom announced that the family would be retaining their own legal counsel, and that no assets should be transferred to David until the validity of the will had been thoroughly investigated. Margaret Brooks noted that she was legally obligated to execute Bobby's will, as written, unless a court specifically ordered her to halt the process, but she agreed to proceed slowly, given the family's intention to contest the inheritance. As we filed out of Brooks and Associates, the family members clustered together in the parking lot, continuing their discussion of legal strategy and their theories about how David had engineered this elaborate fraud. David and I walked to our car alone, suddenly outcasts from the family that had been the center of my entire life. The drive back to Cedar Falls passed in near silence, both of us trying to process what had just happened and what it would mean for our future together. David was now one of the wealthiest people in Riverside, but that wealth came with the burden of a family's hatred and the weight of expectations that neither of us fully understood yet. I was Bobby's granddaughter, but I was also married to the person the family blamed for destroying their financial security. "Did you know?" I finally asked, as we pulled into our apartment complex. "Did you know about your father and Bobby, about the promise, about any of this?" David was quiet for a long time, staring out the windshield at the modest building where we lived, probably thinking about the mansion and properties he had just inherited. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with emotions I couldn't quite identify. "I knew some of it," he admitted. "Not about the will, not about the inheritance, but I knew that someone had been helping my mother and me over the years. Anonymous gifts, scholarships that didn't quite make sense, help that came at exactly the right moments. My mother always said we had a guardian angel, someone my father had asked to watch over us before he died." He paused, turning to look at me directly. "When you started talking about your grandfather, about Bobby Sullivan, who had served in Korea, I began to suspect there might be a connection. The timing was right, the location was right, and some of the stories you told me about his character matched what my mother had said about the person who was helping us. But I never imagined this, Jessica. I never imagined that he would leave us everything he'd built." The revelation that David had suspected a connection between Bobby and his family but had never mentioned it to me felt like another betrayal in a day that was already overflowing with them. We had been together for 2 years, married for 6 months, and he had kept this significant possibility secret from me throughout our entire relationship. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, not able to keep the hurt out of my voice. "Why didn't you say something about thinking there might be a connection?" David's answer revealed the depth of the ethical complexity he had been navigating without any guidance or support. "Because I was afraid," he said simply. "I was afraid that if there was a connection, it would change everything between us. I was afraid that you would think I was using you to get close to your grandfather, that our relationship was somehow calculated or dishonest. I was afraid that if I brought it up, and I was wrong, it would create suspicion and doubt for no reason. And I was afraid that if I brought it up, and I was right, it would put you in an impossible position between your family and me." His fears had turned out to be prophetic. The connection between Bobby and his father had indeed changed everything, and it had absolutely put me in an impossible position between my family and my husband. But his decision to keep his suspicions secret meant that I was facing this crisis without having had any time to prepare for it, emotionally or practically. We sat in the car for another hour, talking through the implications of what had happened and what would happen next. The family would contest the will, which meant months, or possibly years, of legal battles that would consume Bobby's estate in attorney fees and court costs. Our marriage would be subjected to intense scrutiny as the family tried to prove that David had manipulated me into providing information
About Bobby's finances and health. Every conversation we had ever had about my grandfather would be analyzed for evidence of the conspiracy the family was convinced had taken place. But beyond the legal and practical challenges, we were facing the complete destruction of my relationships with my family. My mother, my brother, my uncle, my cousins, they all now saw me as a traitor who had helped a stranger steal their inheritance. The fact that I had been as surprised as anyone by Bobby's will wouldn't matter to them because I had married the beneficiary, which made me complicit in their eyes regardless of my actual knowledge or intentions. The isolation hit me even before we got out of the car. My phone had been buzzing constantly during the drive home, but when I finally looked at the messages, they were all variations of the same theme. Accusations, demands for explanations, ultimatums about choosing between my family and my husband. My mother's text was the most painful. "I don't know who you are anymore, Jessica. The daughter I raised would never have done this to her own family." Ryan's message was more direct. "You and your husband destroyed our lives today.
I hope you're happy with your blood money. Kevin had sent a string of profanity-laden accusations that I deleted without reading completely. Ashley's message was longer and more detailed, outlining all the reasons why the family would be pursuing legal action and warning me that my cooperation with their investigation would be taken into account when they decided whether to maintain any relationship with me after the will was overturned. Even people outside the immediate family had already heard about the will reading and were taking sides. My phone showed missed calls from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, friends of my mother who wanted to express their shock and disappointment, neighbors who had heard rumors about the inheritance and wanted to know if they were true. Word travels fast in small towns, and the story of Bobby Sullivan leaving his fortune to an Asian stranger instead of his own family was exactly the kind of scandal that would dominate conversations at Murphy's Diner for months to come. David was receiving his own flood of communications, though his were coming through channels I didn't recognize. His phone was ringing with calls from numbers in California, messages from relatives and family friends who had apparently been contacted by someone trying to verify his connection to James Chen and Bobby Sullivan. The family's investigation into David's background had begun before we even made it home from the law office. The practical implications of our situation were starting to become clear as well. David was now the owner of Sullivan's Hardware, 12 rental properties, Bobby's house on Maple Street, and investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But he couldn't access any of those assets while the will was being contested, which meant we were stuck in our tiny apartment living on our nursing salaries while technically being millionaires. More immediately problematic, we were going to need our own legal representation to defend against the family's challenge to Bobby's will. Estate litigation was expensive, and we didn't have the resources to match what the combined Sullivan family could afford to spend on trying to overturn the inheritance. The irony of being unable to afford to defend our right to inherit a fortune was not lost on either of us, but the most difficult challenge was the emotional devastation of losing my family over circumstances that neither David nor I had created or anticipated. I had spent my entire life as part of the Sullivan clan, defined by those relationships and that shared history. Now I was cut off from all of it, persona non grata at family gatherings, excluded from the support system that had sustained me through every previous crisis in my life. The loneliness was immediate and overwhelming. I couldn't call my mother for advice about how to handle the stress because she was one of the sources of the stress. I couldn't turn to my brother for support because he was convinced I had betrayed him. I couldn't seek guidance from my uncle or cousins because they were all united in their opposition to me and David. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone except for my husband, and our marriage was now carrying the weight of replacing every other relationship I had lost. David was dealing with his own version of isolation, but his was different because it was familiar. He had grown up as the son of immigrants in California, always slightly outside the mainstream community, always aware of being different from his classmates and neighbors. The hostility from my family was painful for him, but it wasn't the complete destruction of his entire social world the way it was for me. "We'll get through this," he said, as we finally made our way upstairs to our apartment. "Whatever happens with the will, whatever the family does, we'll figure it out together. We have each other, and we have the truth on our side. That has to be enough." I wanted to believe him, but I was struggling to see how the truth would be sufficient to overcome the combined opposition of my entire family and the broader community that would inevitably take sides in this conflict. The truth was that David's father had died saving Bobby's life, that Bobby had kept his promise to care for James's family, that the inheritance was the culmination of a 32-year commitment to honor a debt of gratitude and love. But that truth was going to be buried under legal arguments about mental competence and undue influence and documentary fraud. The truth was also that I had genuinely loved my grandfather without any knowledge of his plans, that I had married David for reasons that had nothing to do with money or inheritance, that I was as shocked as anyone by the contents of Bobby's will.
But that truth was going to be obscured by the family's certainty that I must have been involved in some kind of conspiracy, that no one could be as innocent as I was claiming to be. As we settled into our small apartment that evening, surrounded by the modest possessions of two working nurses, it was almost impossible to believe that we had inherited a fortune that morning. The inheritance felt abstract, theoretical, like something that was happening to other people rather than to us. What felt real was the loss, the isolation, the sudden transformation from beloved family member to enemy outsider. But even in the midst of that devastation, I was beginning to understand something important about Bobby's decision and about the values he had tried to pass down to me during all those Tuesday evening visits. The inheritance wasn't really about money or property, it was about character, integrity, and the courage to do what you believe is right even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. Bobby had chosen David not just because of a promise made 70 years ago, but because David embodied the principles Bobby most valued: service to others, quiet humility, dedication to helping people in need. The family's reaction to losing the inheritance was proving Bobby's assessment of their character, showing that they saw his wealth as their birthright rather than as a responsibility to continue his legacy of generosity. I was beginning to realize that I had a choice to make. I could fight to regain the family acceptance I had lost, probably by distancing myself from David and supporting their legal challenge to the will. Or I could choose to honor Bobby's values and his judgment, supporting David's inheritance and accepting the cost of that decision in terms of family relationships. It wasn't an easy choice, and it wasn't one I was ready to make that evening. But I was starting to understand that this crisis was about more than money or legal documents. It was about who I wanted to be, what I believed in, and whether I had the strength to stand by those beliefs when they required me to stand alone. Part 6: Mine, the manipulation campaign and David's investigation. The emotional warfare began within 24 hours of the will reading. What started as angry phone calls and hostile text messages quickly escalated into a coordinated campaign designed to isolate David and me completely from any support system we might have had in Riverside. The Sullivan family had apparently spent their first evening after the will reading strategizing about how to make our lives so miserable that we would either voluntarily relinquish the inheritance or make mistakes that could be used against us in court. Linda led the charge with a series of phone calls to extended family members, church friends, and community acquaintances who had known Bobby for decades. Her version of events painted David as a sophisticated con artist who had researched the Sullivan family history, discovered Bobby's Korean War service, and fabricated an elaborate story about being the son of Bobby's war buddy. According to Linda's narrative, I was either a naive victim of David's manipulation or a willing accomplice who had helped him gain access to Bobby during his vulnerable final months. The story was compelling because it explained away the cognitive dissonance that Bobby's real decision created. People who had known Bobby Sullivan for 40 or 50 years couldn't reconcile the generous family-oriented man they remembered with someone who would leave his children and grandchildren virtually nothing while giving everything to a stranger. Linda's conspiracy theory allowed them to preserve their image of Bobby as the beloved patriarch they remembered while directing their anger toward the outsiders who had supposedly corrupted his final wishes. Ryan took a more aggressive approach, spreading rumors through social media and the informal networks that connect people in small towns. His Facebook posts described the inheritance as an elaborate fraud perpetrated by immigrants who had targeted elderly veterans with fabricated military stories. He didn't mention David by name in these posts, but anyone who knew the situation understood exactly what he was referencing, and the comment sections filled with outraged responses from people who felt personally offended by the idea that a local hero had been victimized by greedy foreigners. The racial undertones of the family's campaign became more explicit as the days passed. Conversations at Murphy's Diner and the hardware store increasingly focused on how outsiders were taking advantage of honest Americans, how people who didn't understand local values were destroying families for money. David's Chinese heritage became a focal point for resentment that had nothing to do with the actual circumstances of Bobby's will, but everything to do with deeper anxieties about change and belonging in a community that had remained predominantly white and culturally homogeneous for generations. Kevin and Ashley coordinated their efforts through more official channels, contacting local reporters and trying to generate media coverage that would pressure David to renounce the inheritance. They reached out to veterans organizations, suggesting that Bobby had been targeted specifically because of his military service, and that other elderly veterans might be vulnerable to similar scams. They contacted the Better Business Bureau and the State Attorney General's office, filing complaints about elder abuse and inheritance fraud, even though they had no evidence to support these allegations. The campaign was effective because it tapped into existing community loyalties and prejudices. People who had done business with Bobby for decades, who had rented from him or bought supplies from Sullivan's Hardware, felt personally invested in protecting his legacy from what they were told was a cynical exploitation. The fact that none of them had ever heard of David Chen or knew anything about Bobby's connection to the Chen family became evidence of the elaborate deception rather than simply an indication that Bobby had kept certain aspects of his life private. Church became particularly uncomfortable for me. St. Mary's had been Bobby's parish for over 60 years, and many of the congregation had attended his funeral just a month earlier. Now the same people who had offered condolences and shared memories of Bobby's generosity were whispering among themselves about the inheritance scandal and speculating about whether I had known about David's scheme all along. Father Murphy, who had known our family since I was a child, asked me to stay after Mass one Sunday to discuss what he delicately termed the situation. "Jessica," he said, settling into the chair across from me in his small office, "I want you to know that I'm not judging you or your husband. But people in the parish are troubled by what they're hearing about Bobby's will, and they're asking me questions I don't know how to answer. Can you help me understand what really happened?" I tried to explain the true story, the Korean War connection, and Bobby's promise to James Chen, but I could see the doubt in Father Murphy's expression as I spoke. The story sounded fantastic even to me, and I had seen the documentation. To someone hearing it secondhand, without the context of Bobby's character and values, it must have seemed like exactly the kind of elaborate fiction that a sophisticated con artist would create. "I'm sure you believe what you're telling me," Father Murphy said when I finished, his tone gentle but skeptical. "But you have to understand how this looks to people who loved Bobby and can't imagine him making such a decision. Maybe your husband has convinced himself that this story is true. Maybe he's even convinced you. But the Bobby Sullivan we all knew would never have left his own family destitute while giving everything to someone he'd never met." The conversation revealed the fundamental challenge David and I were facing. Everyone who had known Bobby personally was interpreting his decision through the lens of their own relationship with him, and none of those relationships had included knowledge of his commitment to the Chen family. To them, the inheritance looked like a complete departure from Bobby's character, rather than the culmination of values he had held for his entire adult life. Our insistence that we were telling the truth just made us seem more deluded or more dishonest. The isolation became complete when even people who might have been expected to support us began distancing themselves from the controversy. My nursing colleagues at Cedar Falls General started treating me differently, not hostile exactly, but cautious, as if association with me might somehow taint their own reputations. David experienced similar treatment at his job, with supervisors and coworkers suddenly finding reasons to avoid conversations or social interactions that had been routine just weeks earlier. Our landlord, Mr. Patterson, called to inform us that he wouldn't be renewing our lease when it expired in 3 months. He claimed that he needed the apartment for family members, but his discomfort during the conversation made it clear that he had heard about the inheritance controversy and didn't want to be associated with tenants who were involved in what the community saw as elder abuse. The prospect of finding new housing in an area where everyone knew our story and had already decided we were criminals added another layer of stress to our already overwhelming situation. But perhaps the most painful aspect of the family's campaign was the way it distorted every memory of my relationship with Bobby. Conversations that had seemed natural and meaningful at the time were reinterpreted as evidence of my complicity in David's alleged scheme. My regular visits to Bobby's house were now described as surveillance missions where I gathered information about his finances and health. My questions about his military service, which had always been motivated by genuine interest in his experiences, were now seen as fishing expeditions designed to uncover details that could be used to fabricate David's family connection. Even my presence at Bobby's bedside during his final illness was reframed as something sinister. According to the family's narrative, I had used those private moments to pressure him into changing his will, or to gather information about his mental state that David could exploit. The intimacy that had made those visits meaningful to both Bobby and me was transformed into evidence of manipulation and betrayal. The psychological toll of having every loving memory contaminated by suspicion and accusation was devastating. I began questioning my own motivations and reactions, wondering if there had been unconscious elements of calculation in my behavior, even though I knew intellectually that I had acted out of genuine love for my grandfather. The constant barrage of accusations made me second-guess every conversation, every gesture of affection, every moment of connection I had shared with Bobby during his final months. David was dealing with his own version of this psychological assault, but from a different angle. His entire identity as the son of a war hero was being called into question, with family members and community members suggesting that he had fabricated not just the connection to Bobby, but possibly even his father's military service. The attacks weren't just about money or inheritance, they were about his fundamental sense of self and his understanding of his own family history. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm remembering things wrong," he confided to me one evening as we sat in our apartment trying to ignore the latest round of hostile voicemails from my relatives. My mother told me stories about my father's military service, about the friend who had helped our family over the years, but what if I misunderstood something? What if I connected dots that weren't supposed to be connected? His self-doubt was heartbreaking because it showed how effective the family's campaign had been at making us question our own sanity and judgment. Even with documentation and photographs, and Bobby's own written explanation of his decision, the relentless assault on our credibility was making us wonder if we had somehow constructed an elaborate delusion that happened to align with forged documents and fabricated evidence. But it was during this period of maximum isolation and self-doubt that David made a decision that would ultimately change the trajectory of our entire situation. Instead of simply enduring the attacks and waiting for the legal system to validate Bobby's will, he decided to conduct his own investigation into the connection between his father and Bobby. If the family was going to challenge every aspect of his story, he was going to find evidence so compelling that even his harshest critics would be forced to acknowledge the truth. David's investigation began with his mother, Helen Chen, who was still living in the modest house in Sacramento where David had grown up. Helen had never remarried after James's death, dedicating herself to raising David and preserving the memory of his father through stories, photographs, and the careful maintenance of his military medals and commendations. She had always been vague about the source of the financial assistance that had made David's education possible, describing it as help from your father's army friends, without providing specific details. When David called to tell her about Bobby's will and the family's accusations of fraud, Helen was quiet for a long time before responding. "I wondered when this day would come," she finally said. "Bobby Sullivan was the most honorable man I ever knew, and I've been expecting him to do something like this ever since you told me you were getting married to his granddaughter. The coincidence was too great, David. He must have been guiding things somehow, making sure you would find happiness with someone from his own family." Helen's revelation that she had known about David's connection to the Sullivan family and had suspected that Bobby was orchestrating our relationship in some way hit me like a physical blow. If David's mother had known, why hadn't David mentioned it to me during our courtship? How many other secrets were embedded in this situation that was already too complex for me to fully understand? But Helen's next revelation was even more shocking. She had maintained correspondence with Bobby throughout David's childhood and young adulthood, not frequent letters, but annual updates about David's progress in school, his career choices, and his personal milestones. She had sent Bobby photographs of David's graduation from nursing school, copies of commendations David had received at work, even a wedding announcement when David and I got married. Bobby hadn't just been providing financial support from a distance, he had been intimately involved in David's life, through Helen's regular reports. He asked me never to tell David about our correspondence, Helen explained during a phone call that David put on speaker so I could listen. He said it was important that David make his own way in the world, that he shouldn't feel burdened by obligations to someone he'd never met. But Bobby wanted to know everything about David's life, and he was so proud of the man David became. He used to write back and tell me that David was just like his father, someone who dedicated his life to helping others. Helen agreed to send us copies of the letters Bobby had written to her over the years, correspondence that would provide concrete evidence of the relationship between the two families, and Bobby's long-term commitment to David's welfare. But more importantly, she offered to come to Ohio to testify on David's behalf if the legal challenge to the will proceeded to court. At 78 years old, Helen Chen had never traveled further from California than Nevada, but she was prepared to cross the country to defend her late husband's honor and her son's inheritance. The letters, when they arrived by overnight mail, were devastating evidence of the depth of Bobby's commitment to the Chen family. Written over a span of 30 years, they documented not just financial transactions, but emotional investment. Bobby wrote about his pride in David's academic achievements, his admiration for David's choice to become a nurse, his excitement about David's marriage to my granddaughter Jessica, who reminds me so much of the young nurses who took care of us in Korea. One letter, dated just 6 months before Bobby's death, was particularly revealing. Helen, Bobby had written, "I'm getting old, and I know my time is getting short. I want you to know that taking care of you and David has been the greatest privilege of my life, the way I've honored Jimmy's memory every day since he died saving our unit. David has grown into exactly the kind of man Jimmy would have been, and I couldn't be prouder if he were my own son. When I'm gone, he'll inherit everything I've built, not because I don't love my own family, but because he's the one who will use it the way Jimmy would have wanted, to help people and make the world a better place." The letters also revealed details about Bobby's decision-making process that hadn't been included in his will. He had agonized over the impact his choice would have on his biological family, but he had ultimately concluded that leaving them wealthy would not improve their characters or their contributions to society. He had observed their relationship with money over the years, noting their tendency to spend rather than save, to consume rather than contribute, to take rather than give. "I've watched Tom and Linda and the grandchildren for decades," Bobby wrote in one letter, "and I've never seen them help anyone who couldn't help them in return. They see wealth as something to be enjoyed, rather than as a responsibility to be honored. David understands service in a way they never have, and he'll use this inheritance to continue the work Jimmy and I started in Korea, taking care of people who need help." But perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence David uncovered was Bobby's own diary, found in his bedroom closet during our first visit to the house on Maple Street after
the will reading. Bobby had kept a journal sporadically throughout his adult life, documenting major events and reflecting on decisions that required careful consideration. The entries related to David and the inheritance plans spanned several years and provided insight into Bobby's thought process that no forged document could have replicated. The diary entries were written in Bobby's distinctive handwriting, with references to contemporary events and personal details that would have been impossible for an outsider to fabricate. They described Bobby's internal struggle between his love for his biological family and his commitment to James Chen, his gradual recognition that David embodied values that his own relatives had never embraced, and his growing certainty that leaving the inheritance to David was not just the right thing to do, but the only thing that would truly honor James's sacrifice.
One entry, dated 18 months before Bobby's death, captured the essence of his decision with heartbreaking clarity. Today I watched Kevin complain about his job while spending money on things he doesn't need, and I thought about David working double shifts at the hospital to help patients who can't afford proper care. I thought about Ashley planning her third vacation this year, while David sends part of his paycheck to help his mother with medical expenses. I thought about Ryan expecting me to bail him out of his latest financial crisis, while David has never asked me for anything, doesn't even know I've been helping him his whole life. The choice isn't really about Korean War promises anymore. It's about character, and David has it while my own family doesn't. Armed with Helen's letters and Bobby's diary entries, David and I finally had evidence that could counter the family's fraud allegations. The documentation showed a consistent decades-long relationship between Bobby and the Chen family, with details and emotional depth that would have been impossible to fabricate. The letters and diary entries predated David's and my relationship by years, eliminating any possibility that David had manipulated Bobby after meeting me. But David wasn't satisfied with defensive evidence that merely proved he hadn't committed fraud. He wanted to find additional documentation that would demonstrate the historical accuracy of the Korean War story, evidence that would vindicate not just his own integrity but his father's heroism. This led him to contact the National Archives and the Department of Defense, requesting copies of all available military records related to James Chen and Bobby Sullivan's service in Korea. The military records that arrived several weeks later were more comprehensive than anything Margaret Brooks had provided during the will reading. They included complete service histories for both men, casualty reports from the engagement where James Chen was killed, eyewitness accounts of his actions during the battle, and recommendations for posthumous medals that had never been awarded due to bureaucratic oversights that were common during the chaotic final months of the Korean War. Most importantly, the military records included testimony from Robert Sullivan describing in detail how James Chen had saved his life and the lives of several other soldiers during an enemy assault on their position. Bobby's account, given to military investigators just days after the battle, matched exactly the story he had told in his will and in his letters to Helen Chen. The consistency of his narrative across 7 decades, documented in multiple official sources, made any suggestion of fabrication or embellishment impossible to sustain. But David's most significant discovery came when he decided to investigate whether other members of Bobby's military unit were still alive and could provide additional testimony about James Chen's heroism. Using information from the military records, David identified 3 soldiers who had served with Bobby and James in Korea, and who were still living. 2 of them lived in other states, and were too elderly to travel, but one, a man named Frank Moretti, lived just 90 miles away in Columbus. Frank Moretti was 89 years old, living in an assisted care facility, but his memory of the Korean War was vivid and detailed. When David contacted him and explained the situation with Bobby's will, Frank became emotional in a way that demonstrated the depth of the bonds formed between the men who had served together in that brutal conflict. Jimmy Chen was the bravest man I ever knew, Frank said during David's visit to the nursing home. He didn't just save Bobby's life that day, he saved all of us, and Bobby never forgot it, never stopped talking about how he owed Jimmy everything. Bobby used to say that if anything ever happened to him, we should all look out for Jimmy's family the way Jimmy had looked out for us. Frank had maintained sporadic contact with Bobby over the years, and he remembered Bobby mentioning his commitment to help James Chen's family. He had never known the details of Bobby's assistance or the extent of his financial support, but he had always understood that Bobby felt a profound obligation to honor his fallen friend's memory through service to his family. Bobby was the most honorable man I knew, Frank said, his voice shaking with emotion. If he left his money to Jimmy's boy, then that's exactly what Jimmy would have wanted him to do. Anyone who says different didn't know Bobby Sullivan, and they sure didn't know what we went through over there or what we owed each other. Frank agreed to provide a written statement about James Chen's heroism and Bobby Sullivan's character, testimony that would carry enormous weight if the will contest proceeded to trial. As a contemporary witness to the events that had shaped Bobby's commitment to the Chen family, Frank could authenticate details that no amount of documentary evidence could fully convey. But Frank's most valuable contribution was his offer to contact other surviving members of their military unit, men he had kept in touch with through veterans organizations and reunion events. Within 2 weeks, Frank had assembled statements from 5 additional Korean War veterans who remembered James Chen's sacrifice and Bobby Sullivan's dedication to honoring his friend's memory. These men, all in their late 80s or early 90s, represented the last living witnesses to the events that had shaped the rest of Bobby's life. The statements from Bobby's fellow veterans painted a picture of friendship and loyalty that transcended anything the Sullivan family could claim about blood relationships or biological inheritance rights. These men described a bond forged in combat, tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, and maintained through decades of mutual support and shared memory. They spoke of Bobby's character in terms that emphasized his integrity, his faithfulness to his promises, and his understanding of honor as something that required action rather than just sentiment. Bobby Sullivan kept faith with Jimmy Chen for 70 years, wrote one veteran. He never forgot what Jimmy did for us, and he never stopped taking care of Jimmy's family the way Jimmy had taken care of his buddies. That money doesn't belong to Bobby's blood relatives, it belongs to the family of the man who died saving Bobby's life. Armed with Helen's correspondence, Bobby's diary, comprehensive military records, and testimony from surviving veterans, David had assembled evidence that would be nearly impossible to discredit in court. The documentation spanned 70 years and included multiple independent sources, all confirming the same basic story of sacrifice, promise-keeping, and honor that Bobby had described in his will. Any suggestion that David had fabricated his connection to Bobby or manipulated an elderly man into changing his inheritance plans would have to account for decades of consistent documentation and testimony from credible witnesses who had no financial stake in the outcome. But perhaps the most powerful evidence David discovered was something that couldn't be documented or verified through official channels: the profound similarity between his own character and values and those that Bobby had exhibited throughout his life. Both men had chosen careers in service to others, both had demonstrated quiet integrity in their personal relationships, and both had shown the kind of selflessness that prioritizes helping others over accumulating wealth for themselves. The inheritance wasn't just about honoring a promise made 70 years ago in Korea. It was about recognizing character, rewarding virtue, and ensuring that Bobby's legacy of generosity and service would continue through someone who embodied those same values. The Sullivan family's reaction to losing the inheritance had revealed their own priorities and character, proving Bobby's assessment that they saw wealth as an entitlement rather than as a responsibility. As David compiled his evidence and prepared for the legal battle that was certain to come, I was forced to confront the fundamental question that had been haunting me since the will reading. Was I going to stand by my husband and support his inheritance, even if it meant permanent estrangement from my biological family, or was I going to try to maintain family relationships by distancing myself from David and supporting their challenge to Bobby's will? The choice wasn't just about money or legal documents, it was about what I believed in, what kind of person I wanted to be, and whether I had the courage to honor Bobby's values, even when doing so required me to stand against everyone else I had ever loved. The evidence David had gathered made it clear that the inheritance was legitimate and that Bobby's decision had been based on decades of careful consideration. But knowing that Bobby was right didn't make it easier to accept the complete destruction of my family relationships. The investigation phase was drawing to a close, and soon we would have to present our evidence in court and defend our right to inherit Bobby's fortune. But regardless of what the legal system decided, I knew that the real battle was already over. Bobby had chosen David not just because of a promise, but because David was the kind of person who would use wealth to help others rather than just to help himself. The family's reaction to that choice had proven Bobby's assessment of their character, and now I had to decide whether I would prove his assessment of mine. Parts 10-14. The final confrontation and resolution. The courthouse in downtown Riverside had never seen a case quite like Sullivan versus Chen. By the time the trial date arrived in November, 6 months after Bobby's death, the entire community had chosen sides in what had become less about legal inheritance and more about fundamental questions of loyalty, honor, and what family really means. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway, all of them eager to witness the final chapter of a story that had consumed the town's attention for months. Judge Patricia Hoffman had been assigned to the case, a woman in her early 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense jurisprudence and little patience for family drama that masqueraded as legal dispute. She had reviewed all the preliminary filings and evidence submissions, and her opening remarks made it clear that she understood this case would be decided on facts and law rather than emotion and community sentiment. The Sullivan family had retained Marcus Webb, a prominent estate attorney from Columbus, who specialized in will contests. Webb was expensive, polished, and aggressive, exactly the kind of lawyer who thrived on high-profile cases that generated media attention. His opening statement painted Bobby's will as the tragic result of elder abuse, a sophisticated fraud perpetrated by David Chen with Jessica's complicit assistance, designed to steal an inheritance from Bobby's rightful heirs through fabricated military connections and manufactured emotional manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Webb began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "this case is about the exploitation of a vulnerable elderly man by strangers who researched his life, discovered his military service, and constructed an elaborate fiction to steal his life's work from his own children and grandchildren. The evidence will show that Robert Sullivan was suffering from declining mental capacity, that he was isolated from his family during his final months, and that he was systematically manipulated into believing stories that have no basis in historical fact." Webb's strategy was clear from his opening statement. He would challenge every aspect of David's connection to Bobby, questioning the authenticity of military records, the legitimacy of correspondence between Bobby and Helen Chen, and the mental competence of Bobby during the period when he revised his will. Webb promised to prove that David had researched Bobby's military service, fabricated documents supporting the James Chen connection, and used Jessica as an unwitting accomplice to gain access to Bobby's home and financial information. Our attorney Sarah Mitchell was younger and less experienced than Webb, but she had agreed to represent us on a contingency basis after reviewing David's evidence and becoming convinced that the inheritance was legitimate. Mitchell's opening statement was quieter than Webb's theatrical performance, but it carried the weight of documented truth rather than speculative accusations. "The evidence in this case will show that Robert Sullivan made his inheritance decisions based on a lifetime of reflection about honor, character, and the promises we make to those we love," Mitchell said, addressing the jury with calm certainty. "You will see decades of correspondence between Mr. Sullivan and Helen Chen, the mother of the beneficiary. You will read Mr. Sullivan's own diary entries documenting his reasons for leaving his estate to David Chen. You will hear testimony from surviving veterans who served with both Robert Sullivan and James Chen in Korea, men who witnessed the heroism that created the bond between these two families. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the basic facts of Bobby's life and death. Medical experts testified about Bobby's mental state during his final months, with his personal physician confirming that Bobby had shown no signs of cognitive decline or dementia. Margaret Brooks presented detailed documentation of her conversations with Bobby about his will, including notes from meetings where Bobby had explained his decision-making process and demonstrated complete understanding of the legal and financial implications of his choices. The family's medical expert, a psychiatrist who had never examined Bobby but had reviewed his medical records, suggested that Bobby's emphysema medication could have affected his judgment and made him susceptible to manipulation. But this testimony was undermined when Mitchell produced pharmacy records showing that Bobby had been on the same medications for years without any previous evidence of impaired decision-making, and that he had been reducing his dosage during the period when he was revising his will. Webb's attempt to portray Bobby as mentally incompetent collapsed completely when Mitchell introduced recordings that Bobby had made on his own initiative, audio files found on his computer where he had documented his inheritance plans and his reasons for making them. In Bobby's own voice, clear and thoughtful, the jury heard him explain his assessment of his family's character and his commitment to honoring James Chen through support for David. "I've been thinking about this decision for 2 years," Bobby's recorded voice said to the silent courtroom, "and I know it will hurt my children and grandchildren, but I've watched them their whole lives, and I've never seen them put anyone else's needs before their own." David Chen chooses to spend his life taking care of sick people, often for less money than he could make doing something else. "That's the kind of person Jimmy was, and that's the kind of person who should inherit what I've built." The recording was devastating to the family's case because it demonstrated not only Bobby's mental competence, but his deep consideration of the emotional impact his decision would have on his relatives. He wasn't acting impulsively or under outside influence, he was making a carefully reasoned choice based on his observations of character and his understanding of responsibility. But the most powerful testimony came during the second week, when Helen Chen took the witness stand. At 78 years old, Helen had never been comfortable with public attention, but her quiet dignity and obvious sincerity made her the most compelling witness in the entire trial. She described her relationship with Bobby in terms that revealed the depth of his commitment to her family and his genuine affection for David. "Mr. Sullivan never missed David's birthday," Helen testified, her voice soft but clear in the hushed courtroom. "Every year for 32 years, he sent a card with a note about how proud he was of David's accomplishments. When David graduated from nursing school, Mr. Sullivan wrote to tell me that Jimmy would have been so proud to see his son choosing a career that helped other people." Helen's testimony included details that would have been impossible to fabricate or research from public sources. She described Bobby's personality quirks, his sense of humor, his concerns about David's career choices and personal relationships. The correspondence between Helen and Bobby revealed a genuine friendship that had developed over decades, not the cold financial transaction that the family had tried to portray. Webb's cross-examination of Helen was aggressive to the point of being cruel, suggesting that she had coached David to impersonate her deceased husband, and that she had conspired with Bobby to defraud his biological family. But Helen's responses were so obviously truthful, her confusion about the accusations so genuine, that Webb's attack seemed to backfire with the jury. "I loved my husband very much," Helen said when Webb suggested that she had exaggerated James's heroism to manipulate Bobby's emotions. "I didn't need to make up stories about how brave he was. The army told me what he did, how he saved his friends. I was proud of him for 32 years before I ever heard Bobby Sullivan's name." The military evidence proved impossible for Webb to discredit. The Department of Defense records were comprehensive and consistent, documenting not only James Chen's service and death, but the specific circumstances of his heroism. The casualty reports included testimony from multiple witnesses, including Bobby Sullivan, describing how James had exposed himself to enemy fire to protect his fellow soldiers. Frank Moretti's appearance as a witness provided emotional context that no document could match. At 89 years old, Frank needed assistance walking to the witness stand, but his memory of the Korean War was vivid and his testimony about James Chen's character was unshakable. When Webb tried to suggest that Frank's recollections were unreliable due to his age, Frank responded with dignity that resonated throughout the courtroom. "Young man," Frank said, looking directly at Webb, "I may forget where I put my glasses, but I'll never forget watching Jimmy Chen die saving my life and Bobby Sullivan's life. That's not the kind of thing a man forgets, no matter how old he gets." The testimony from surviving veterans created an emotional foundation that supported all of the documentary evidence. These men, now in their late 80s and early 90s, had traveled from across the country to testify about their memories of James Chen and Bobby Sullivan. Their descriptions of the bond between the two men and their understanding of Bobby's commitment to James's family provided context that transformed the inheritance from a legal technicality into a story of love, honor, and faithfulness that spanned 7 decades. But Webb's most desperate strategy was his attempt to portray me as the mastermind behind an elaborate conspiracy. He suggested that I had researched David's family background before our relationship began, that I had deliberately sought him out because I knew about the potential connection to Bobby, and that I had orchestrated our entire courtship to position David for inheritance fraud. The theory required the jury to believe that I had somehow discovered Bobby's connection to the Chen family, researched David's background and location, engineered our meeting at the hospital where we both worked, and sustained a fake relationship for over 2 years, including marriage, all to position David to inherit Bobby's estate. The complexity of such a conspiracy, and the psychological profile it would have required, made Webb's theory seem more like fiction than fact. Mitchell's defense of me was straightforward and supported by abundant evidence. She produced records of my work history showing that I had been employed at Cedar Falls General for 3 years before meeting David, eliminating any possibility that I had sought the job to find him. She presented testimony from colleagues who had witnessed the natural development of our relationship, from initial professional acquaintance to friendship to romance to marriage. Most importantly, Mitchell introduced evidence that I had never shown any particular interest in Bobby's finances or inheritance plans during the years I had cared for him. Testimony from Margaret Brooks confirmed that I had never asked questions about Bobby's will or expressed curiosity about his estate planning. My visits to Bobby's house had been motivated by genuine affection and concern for his well-being, not by financial calculation or information gathering. The family's own testimony sometimes undermined their case more than it supported it. Tom's description of his relationship with Bobby revealed a pattern of sporadic contact, motivated primarily by business concerns or requests for financial assistance. Kevin's testimony about his visits to Bobby's house made it clear that he had been more interested in Bobby's property and possessions than in Bobby's well-being or company. Linda's testimony was the most painful for me personally, as she described feeling replaced in Bobby's affections by my regular visits and my apparent ease with his personality and interests. But her resentment toward my close relationship with Bobby actually supported the legitimacy of that relationship, proving that it was genuine rather than calculated. Jessica was always his favorite, Linda said, during cross-examination, her voice bitter with years of accumulated resentment. She understood him in ways the rest of us never could. She knew how to talk to him about the war, about his business, about all the things that mattered to him. I suppose it makes sense that he would choose her husband over his own children. The irony of Linda's testimony was that it confirmed Bobby's assessment of family character while revealing her own lack of insight into what had made my relationship with Bobby meaningful. I had connected with Bobby not because I was calculating or manipulative, but because I had genuinely cared about his experiences, his values, and his well-being. The family had seen my closeness with Bobby as a threat to their inheritance expectations, rather than as an expression of love and respect. Ashley's testimony revealed similar patterns of self-interest disguised as family concern. Her description of her interactions with Bobby focused heavily on financial planning and estate management, subjects that had clearly made Bobby uncomfortable, even though Ashley had interpreted his discomfort as evidence of cognitive decline. Grandpa Bobby was getting confused about money matters, Ashley testified. He wouldn't listen to advice about modernizing his investments or developing his properties more efficiently. He seemed to think that keeping things simple was better than maximizing returns, which didn't make sense for someone with his level of wealth. Mitchell's cross-examination revealed that Ashley's advice had consistently focused on strategies that would have increased the value of Bobby's estate at the time of his death, presumably for the benefit of his heirs, rather than arrangements that would have improved Bobby's quality of life during his remaining years. Ashley's testimony inadvertently demonstrated that she had viewed Bobby's wealth as her inheritance long before his death, and that she had been frustrated by his refusal to manage his finances in ways that would have benefited her expectations. The trial's turning point came when Webb made the strategic error of calling David as a hostile witness, apparently believing that he could expose contradictions in David's story or provoke him into admissions that would support the fraud allegations. But David's testimony was calm, consistent, and obviously truthful. His description of growing up without knowledge of Bobby's assistance, his genuine surprise at learning about the inheritance, and his commitment to using the wealth responsibly created exactly the impression that Bobby's will had suggested it would. "I never asked for this inheritance," David testified when Webb pressed him about his motivations for accepting Bobby's bequest. "I didn't know it existed until the will was read. But now that I understand what Mr. Sullivan was trying to do, I feel an obligation to honor his wishes and his memory. He believed that I would use this wealth the way my father would have used it, to help people who need help. That's what I intend to do." Webb's attempts to portray David as greedy or calculating fell flat because David's career choices and lifestyle contradicted those characterizations. David had chosen nursing over more lucrative professions, had consistently volunteered for additional shifts to help understaffed departments, and had never shown any interest in wealth or luxury. His modest apartment, used car, and simple lifestyle were consistent with someone who valued service over financial gain. But perhaps the most damaging testimony for the family's case came from Bobby's former business associates and tenants, people who had interacted with him regularly during his final years. These witnesses described Bobby as mentally sharp, emotionally stable, and completely capable of making complex business and personal decisions right up until his death. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had rented from Bobby for 15 years, described conversations with him just weeks before his death about maintenance issues and lease renewals. "Mr. Sullivan was completely himself," she testified. "He was thinking clearly, making plans for the future, talking about improvements he wanted to make to the property. He didn't seem sick or confused or influenced by anybody else." Similar testimony came from suppliers to Sullivan's hardware, customers who had interacted with Bobby regularly, and neighbors who had maintained friendships with him for decades. The consistent picture that emerged was of a man who remained intellectually capable and emotionally stable throughout his final months, someone who was making considered decisions about his life and his legacy. The jury deliberated for 2 days, a relatively short time for such a complex case, but long enough to review all the evidence thoroughly. When they returned to the courtroom, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Bobby's will was valid, his mental capacity had been unimpaired, and there was no evidence of fraud, undue influence, or manipulation. David's inheritance was legitimate and would be upheld in its entirety. Judge Hoffman's comments following the verdict provided additional validation for Bobby's decision and criticism of the family's challenge. The evidence in this case demonstrates that Robert Sullivan made his inheritance decisions based on careful consideration of character, values, and personal obligation, she said. While the court understands that these decisions were painful for his biological family, there is no legal basis for overturning the clearly expressed wishes of a competent testator. The judge also addressed the family's conduct during the litigation, noting that their campaign to discredit David and me had included elements of harassment and defamation that reflected poorly on their own character. The plaintiff's reaction to Mr. Sullivan's will has unfortunately validated his assessment of their priorities and values, Judge Hoffman observed. Their focus on challenging the inheritance rather than honoring Mr. Sullivan's memory suggests that their primary concern was financial rather than emotional. The immediate aftermath of the verdict was chaotic, with family members storming out of the courtroom and reporters attempting to get statements from both sides. David and I left through a side entrance, avoiding the media circus and the family confrontation that was undoubtedly taking place in the courthouse lobby. We drove home in relative silence, both of us emotionally exhausted by 6 months of legal battle and community controversy. But the real resolution of our story didn't come in the courthouse, it came over the following months as we began the process of actually inheriting Bobby's estate and deciding how to use the wealth he had entrusted to us. The hardware store, the rental properties, the investments, and the house on Maple Street were now our responsibility, and with them came the obligation to honor Bobby's values and continue his legacy of generosity. Our first decision was about the hardware store, which had been Bobby's pride and joy for over 60 years. We could have sold it immediately and invested the proceeds, but that would have eliminated dozens of jobs and closed a business that served as a community gathering place for contractors, homeowners, and people who needed help with repairs and projects. Instead, we hired Bobby's longtime assistant manager to run the store while we learned the business ourselves, ensuring that it would continue to operate according to Bobby's principles of fair pricing, quality service, and community support. The rental properties presented similar challenges and opportunities. We could have raised rents to market rates, evicted tenants who were behind on payments, or sold the properties to developers who would have torn them down for more profitable projects. Instead, we maintained Bobby's approach of providing affordable housing for working-class families, keeping rents reasonable, and working with tenants who were experiencing temporary financial difficulties. But our most meaningful decision involved the establishment of the James Chen Memorial Fund, a foundation dedicated to supporting the families of military personnel killed in action. Using a significant portion of Bobby's liquid assets, we created an endowment that would provide scholarships, emergency financial assistance, and long-term support for the surviving spouses and children of fallen soldiers. The fund was designed to operate exactly as Bobby had operated in supporting David's family, providing help without publicity or recognition, focusing on practical assistance that would make a real difference in people's lives. The Memorial Fund's first recipient was a young widow from Fort Campbell, whose husband had been killed in Afghanistan, leaving her with 2 small children and no family support system. The fund paid for her nursing school tuition, provided childcare assistance while she attended classes, and helped her purchase a reliable car that she needed for work and transportation. When she graduated and found employment at a local hospital, she sent us a photograph of herself in her nursing uniform with a note that read, "Thank you for giving me the chance to build a future for my children. Your husband's father would be proud." The community's reaction to our decisions was mixed, with some people gradually accepting that we were committed to using Bobby's wealth responsibly, while others remained convinced that we were illegitimate inheritors who didn't deserve the good fortune that had come our way. But over time, our actions spoke louder than the family's accusations, and most people began to judge us based on what we actually did, rather than on the stories they had heard about how we had acquired our resources. The family never reconciled with our inheritance or with us personally. Tom, Linda, Kevin, Ashley, and Ryan maintained their belief that Bobby's will had been the result of fraud or manipulation, and they continued to view David and me as thieves who had stolen their birthright. The legal challenge had been expensive for them, and their bitterness was compounded by the financial strain of unsuccessful litigation and the loss of inheritance they had counted on for their own security. But their reaction to losing the court case revealed the character traits that Bobby had observed and that had influenced his decision to leave his wealth elsewhere. Instead of accepting the verdict and moving forward with their lives, they spent years pursuing appeals and additional legal challenges, all of which were unsuccessful, but which consumed time, money, and emotional energy that could have been directed toward more productive activities. Ryan's response was the most self-destructive, as he convinced himself that David and I owed him compensation for his stolen inheritance and began making increasingly aggressive demands for money to support his continuing legal challenges. When we refused to give him cash to fund lawsuits against us, Ryan's behavior became erratic and threatening enough that we had to obtain a restraining order to protect ourselves from harassment. Kevin and Ashley channeled their resentment into social media campaigns and community gossip that portrayed them as victims of an elaborate fraud, but their constant complaining eventually alienated even people who had initially been sympathetic to their situation. Their inability to move past the inheritance dispute and rebuild their lives demonstrated exactly the kind of character weakness that Bobby had identified and that had influenced his decision to leave his wealth to someone else. Linda's reaction was the most painful for me personally because it involved the complete termination of our mother-daughter relationship. She never forgave me for marrying David or for supporting his inheritance, and she interpreted my loyalty to my husband as a betrayal of my family and my upbringing. We attempted to maintain some contact during the first year after the trial, but every conversation eventually turned into accusations and recriminations that made any real relationship impossible. Tom was more measured in his response, but no less final in his rejection of David and me. He focused his resentment on what he saw as Bobby's fundamental betrayal of family loyalty, and he couldn't accept that Bobby's decision had been based on legitimate concerns about character and values, rather than on mental incompetence or outside manipulation. Tom's inability to acknowledge any validity in Bobby's assessment of the family's priorities made reconciliation impossible, even though he was less openly hostile than some of his relatives. The complete break with my biological family was devastating, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in my life, I was free from the complex web of obligations, expectations, and resentments that had always characterized Sullivan family relationships. David and I could make decisions based on our own values and priorities, rather than on what would satisfy or appease relatives who had their own agendas and assumptions about how we should live. More importantly, we were able to build relationships with people who shared our commitment to service and community contribution. The James Chen Memorial Fund brought us into contact with military families, veterans organizations, and other people who understood sacrifice, honor, and the importance of keeping promises to those who had given their lives for others. These relationships were based on shared values, rather than biological connections, and they provided the kind of meaningful community that Bobby had always represented in my life. David's relationship with Helen Chen deepened as we spent more time with her and learned more about James's life and character. Helen moved from California to Ohio so that she could be closer to us and participate more actively in the Memorial Fund's activities. Her presence in our lives provided continuity with the values that had motivated Bobby's original promise and reminded us constantly of the responsibility we had inherited along with his wealth. But perhaps the most profound change in our lives was our move to Bobby's house on Maple Street, which we renovated and updated while preserving the character and history that had made it special. Living in the house where Bobby had made his plans and decisions gave us daily reminders of his values and his commitment to using wealth as a tool for helping others rather than just improving his own circumstances. The house also contained additional discoveries that continued to reveal the depth of Bobby's planning and the extent of his commitment to honoring James Chen's memory. In Bobby's basement office, we found files documenting other military families he had helped over the years, veterans who had struggled with medical bills, education costs, or housing problems that Bobby had quietly addressed without publicity or recognition. These files revealed that David's family had not been Bobby's only beneficiaries of his sense of obligation to fallen comrades. Bobby had maintained a private welfare system for dozens of families over the decades, providing assistance that had prevented foreclosures, funded college educations, and covered medical expenses that would otherwise have been devastating. The scale of his generosity was staggering, and it explained why his official estate had been smaller than some people had expected, even though his income from the hardware store and rental properties had been substantial. The discovery of Bobby's extensive charitable activities provided additional context for his decision to leave his estate to David rather than to his biological family. Bobby hadn't just been honoring a promise to James Chen, he had been ensuring that his pattern of quiet generosity would continue under someone who shared his values and his understanding of wealth as responsibility rather than privilege. As we settled into our new life and our new responsibilities, David and I often reflected on the strange series of coincidences and connections that had brought us together and led to our inheritance of Bobby's legacy. Our meeting at the hospital had seemed random at the time, but in retrospect it appeared to have been part of a larger pattern that Bobby had somehow influenced or encouraged. Helen Chen's letters revealed that Bobby had been aware of David's location and career choices for years before we met, and that he had been pleased when David chose to work in Ohio rather than remaining in California. While Bobby had never directly interfered in David's life, he had been quietly supportive of decisions that brought David closer to the Sullivan family and to the possibility of meaningful connections with Bobby's own relatives. "I think Bobby was playing matchmaker," Helen confided to us one evening as we sat on the porch of the Maple Street house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "He knew that you were his granddaughter Jessica, and he knew that David was like a grandson to him. He probably hoped that you would find each other, that his two families could become one family." The idea that Bobby had somehow orchestrated our meeting and courtship was both touching and slightly unsettling, but it was consistent with his character as someone who planned carefully and thought strategically about how to accomplish his goals. Whether or not he had actively encouraged our relationship, he had certainly been prepared to welcome it and to use it as the foundation for decisions that would benefit both families, while honoring his commitment to James Chen. 2 years after the trial, David and I returned to the courthouse for a very different kind of ceremony. Judge Hoffman, who had presided over our inheritance case, performed our wedding renewal ceremony in the same room where we had defended our right to Bobby's estate. This time, the courtroom was filled with friends rather than enemies, with people who supported our marriage and our commitment to using Bobby's legacy responsibly. Frank Moretti, despite his advanced age, traveled to Riverside for the ceremony and served as one of our witnesses. Helen Chen stood beside me as my matron of honor, taking the place that my mother would have occupied if family relationships hadn't been destroyed by the inheritance dispute. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, a celebration of love that had survived legal challenge and community controversy. But the most important element of the renewal ceremony was our public commitment to continue Bobby's work and to honor James Chen's memory through service to others. We announced the formal establishment of the James Chen Memorial Fund as a permanent foundation, along with our intention to donate the majority of Bobby's estate to charitable causes, while retaining only enough resources to maintain the hardware store and rental properties that served community needs. The announcement generated significant media coverage, not because of the controversy that had surrounded our inheritance, but because of the unusual decision to give away wealth rather than accumulate it. Local newspapers ran features about our plans for the memorial fund and our commitment to continuing Bobby's tradition of quiet generosity. The coverage helped shift public perception of our inheritance from a scandalous family dispute to a story of honor, service, and the fulfillment of promises made across generations. The family's reaction to our charitable commitments was predictably negative, with several relatives suggesting that our decision to give away their inheritance was additional evidence of our unfitness to receive Bobby's estate. But their complaints about our generosity only reinforced Bobby's original assessment of their character and priorities, demonstrating that they remained focused on personal wealth accumulation rather than community service. As we approached the 3rd anniversary of Bobby's death and the 2nd anniversary of our court victory, Dick and I had established routines and relationships that gave structure and meaning to our lives as inheritors of Bobby's legacy. We spent mornings at the hardware store, learning the business and maintaining relationships with customers who had been Bobby's friends and neighbors for decades. Afternoons were devoted to managing the rental properties and working with tenants who needed assistance or support. Evenings were reserved for memorial fund activities, reviewing applications for assistance, visiting military families who needed help, and planning events that would honor James Chen's memory while providing resources for families facing similar challenges. The work was demanding but fulfilling, providing daily reminders of why Bobby had considered wealth a responsibility rather than a privilege. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of our new life was the sense of continuity with values and principles that transcended individual lifetimes. Bobby's commitment to James Chen had lasted for 70 years, spanning from a battlefield in Korea to a courthouse in Ohio. Our commitment to both men's memories would continue for the rest of our lives and beyond, as the Memorial Fund and other charitable activities created permanent legacies that would help people long after we were gone. The inheritance had never really been about money, despite all the legal arguments and family disputes that had focused on financial assets. It had been about character, honor, and the kind of love that expresses itself through service to others. Bobby had recognized those qualities in David, just as he had recognized their absence in his biological family, and his bequest had been designed to ensure that his values would continue through someone who shared them. Standing in Bobby's kitchen one evening, preparing dinner with David and Helen, while discussing plans for the Memorial Fund's expansion, I finally understood the deeper meaning of Bobby's decision. He hadn't just left David his wealth, he had created a family based on shared principles rather than shared genetics. We were bound together, not by blood, but by commitment to ideals that made life meaningful and death bearable. The Sullivan family had lost more than an inheritance when Bobby's will was read. They had lost the opportunity to be part of something larger than themselves, something that connected them to values of service and sacrifice that give wealth its true meaning. Their rejection of Bobby's decision had excluded them from a legacy that was about more than money, more than property, more than financial security. But David and I had gained more than we had inherited. We had found our purpose, our community, and our understanding of what it meant to honor those who had given their lives for others. Bobby's promise to James Chen had become our promise to both of them, and through that promise, we had discovered the kind of love that transcends death, bridges generations, and transforms inheritance from privilege into responsibility. The story that had begun with a shocking will reading had become something entirely different, a testament to the power of promises kept, values honored, and love expressed through service. Bobby Sullivan and James Chen had both been dead for years, but their friendship and their principles continued to shape lives, help families, and create hope for people who needed it most. That was the real inheritance, the one that could never be challenged in court or diminished by family disputes. It was the inheritance of character, and it would last forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.